For more than 300 years, Britain's royal guards followed one unbreakable rule, until one little girl fell right in front of a royal guard, and the impossible happened.
London's mornings have a particular kind of silence, the kind that only exists before the city fully wakes up. At 4:30, the streets around Buckingham Palace were empty except for a few early joggers and the occasional black cab gliding past. Inside the palace grounds, however, a different kind of stillness reigned, the disciplined, deliberate stillness of the royal guard. James Whitmore stood at his post, boots polished to a mirror shine, bearskin cap sitting perfectly straight, rifle held at exactly the regulation angle. He was 24 years old, but standing there, motionless, he could have been any age at all. That was the point. The uniform erased the individual. It turned a person into a symbol. James came from a family with deep roots in the Guards. His grandfather, Edward Whitmore, had served for 18 years, standing at these very gates through rain, sleet, and the occasional heckling tourist. His father had chosen a different path, joining the police force instead. But the stories James grew up on were always about the Guards, about discipline, about honor, about a tradition older than most nations. "You don't just wear the uniform," his grandfather used to tell him, back when James was a boy visiting him in his small flat in Greenwich. "You carry 300 years on your shoulders. Every guard before you stood exactly where you'll stand. Every guard after you will stand there too. You are one link in a very long chain." James had taken that lesson seriously. Through the brutal selection process, through months of training that tested not just physical endurance but mental discipline, learning to stand for hours without so much as blinking too obviously, learning to control his breathing, his posture, his reactions to anything and everything a crowd might throw at him. He had internalized one rule above all others. The guard does not react. Instructors had told him story after story to reinforce this. Guards who had stood firm while bees landed on their faces. Guards who hadn't flinched when tourists screamed directly into their ears to try to get a reaction for a viral video. Guards who had remained utterly still even when they later admitted to feeling faint from the heat, refusing to break formation until they were properly relieved of duty. "The moment you react," his training sergeant had said, "you're no longer a symbol. You're just a person in a costume. And the whole point is that you're not just a person. You're centuries of history standing in one spot." It was a beautiful idea, and James believed it. He believed it with the same quiet conviction his grandfather had. And for 2 years he had lived it perfectly. Through cold winters, through sweltering summers, through countless attempts by tourists and pranksters to break his composure. Until the day everything changed. An ordinary Tuesday, the day started like any other. James arrived at the barracks before dawn, went through the routine inspection, had his uniform checked by a superior officer down to the smallest detail, the precise fold of his gloves, the shine on his buttons, the angle of his cap. By 7 in the morning, he was in position outside the palace gates, ready for what would be, by all appearances, a completely unremarkable day. The crowds began building by mid-morning, as they always did. Tour groups from all over the world gathered along the railings, cameras raised, children perched on their parents' shoulders trying to get a better view. Guides recited the history of the guard change ceremony in a dozen different languages. Street performers worked the edges of the crowd. It was, in every sense, a completely typical Tuesday at Buckingham Palace. James stood in his position near one of the side gates, slightly apart from the main ceremonial area, where the crowd was thinner but still steady. Families would stop, take photos, sometimes try to get him to smile or blink, and then move on toward the main courtyard where the actual changing of the guard ceremony would soon begin. Among the crowd that morning was a woman named Sarah Bennett, visiting London from Manchester with her daughter Lily, who had just turned 6. It was Lily's first trip to London, and she had been talking about seeing the guards with the big furry hats for weeks. Sarah had promised her they would come see them on this trip, and now here they were, weaving through the crowd, Lily's small hand gripped tightly in her mother's. "Can we get closer, Mummy?" Lily asked, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Just a little bit, sweetheart. Stay close to me." But children have a way of slipping free in crowds, especially excited 6-year-olds fascinated by tall men in bright red coats and towering black hats. As Sarah paused to check a map on her phone, trying to figure out the best spot to watch the ceremony from. Lily's hand slipped from hers and the little girl darted forward, eager to get a closer look at the guard standing so still, so impossibly still, that she wondered for a moment if he was even real. "Lily," Sarah called, but the crowd had shifted, and for a few seconds, she lost sight of her daughter entirely. The fall Lily made her way to the front of the small crowd gathered near James's post, staring up at him with wide-eyed wonder. To a 6-year-old, he looked like something out of a storybook. The bright red coat, the golden buttons, the enormous black hat, and that incredible, unnatural stillness. She had never seen an adult stand so perfectly motionless before. She took another step forward, trying to get an even closer look, right at the edge of the barrier separating the public from the guard's path. Her sneaker caught on an uneven paving stone, and before she could catch herself, she pitched forward, arms flailing, and fell hard onto the pavement, directly in front of James, close enough that her small hand landed near the toe of his polished boot. The sound she made wasn't a scream. It was a sharp, surprised gasp, followed by a stunned silence as she registered the sting in her scraped knee and the shock of hitting the ground. Blood began to well up along a thin scrape on her knee. For a moment she didn't cry, she was too stunned. She simply looked up, straight into the shadowed face beneath the guard's enormous hat. Every instinct in James's training screamed at him to remain still. This was, after all, exactly the kind of scenario his instructors had warned him about. A distraction designed, whether intentionally or not, to break his composure. Don't move. Don't react. Stay in position until officially relieved. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. But James looked down at this little girl, tears now beginning to well in her eyes, blood trickling slowly down her shin, looking up at him with an expression that was somewhere between fear and confusion, and something inside him shifted. He thought for just a fraction of a second of his grandfather's stories. Not the ones about discipline, but the quieter ones told less often. About the guards who had occasionally bent the rules for good reason, and had never once regretted it. He thought about what the uniform was actually supposed to represent. Not coldness, not indifference, but a kind of steady, quiet strength that people could rely on. And in that fraction of a second, James made a decision that would change the course of his career. Breaking protocol, he shifted his rifle to his left side, smoothly and deliberately, and lowered himself down onto one knee, directly in front of the crying child. The crowd around them went utterly silent. Phones that had been filming casually suddenly zoomed in, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. "Hey there," James said softly, his voice carrying none of the rigid formality that guards were known for. "Are you all right?" Lily blinked up at him, startled that the statue had spoken, startled even more that it had moved at all. She managed a small nod, though her lower lip was trembling. James reached into his coat and pulled out a small handkerchief he carried, tucked away for emergencies, though he'd certainly never imagined using it like this. Gently, carefully, he pressed it against the scrape on her knee. "That's quite a fall," he said, keeping his voice calm and warm. "But you know what? You didn't even cry out. That's very brave." By now, Sarah had pushed through the crowd, panic written across her face as she searched for her daughter. When she spotted Lily sitting on the ground with a royal guard kneeling beside her, tending to her scraped knee, she froze for a moment in disbelief before rushing forward. "Oh my God, Lily. Are you okay?" "I'm so sorry, officer. I turned around for just a second and—" James looked up at her, his expression calm. "She's fine, ma'am. Just a small scrape."